Can everyone see my screen? Like that. Well, this is intro to introductions. We'll just talk about what I think is personally the most important part of an extemp speech, and that's your intro speech and how you conduct yourself there, because that really frames the rest of your speech, and we'll talk about that more and how that you lay the groundwork of the rest of your extemp speech in the intro. But before that, maybe you want to introduce ourselves. Peter, you want to go first?
Yeah, so my name is Peter Alisky. I've been doing extemp since I've been in high school, and I agree with Ananth that the introduction is the most important part of the speech, especially with if you're not in super high level competition.
Yeah, and my name's Ananth. I compete in Minnesota. I primarily do USX, and I've been doing extemp since 8th grade.
Yeah, I'm from Colorado. Sorry for not mentioning.
You're good. And so briefly, we're just going to go over why the intro matters. So just basically elaborating on what we were just soapboxing about for the past few minutes. Then we'll talk about the different parts of the introduction, from the AGD to the statement of significance, give you some very concrete things. You know, I think a lot of people, they give like this very generic advice, but I'm hoping that we can give you some actionable steps to improve your different parts of an extemp speech. So like specific drills and specific ways to think about these different parts of an intro. We'll give an example of an effective introduction by the 2014 IX National Champion for NSDA, Miles Safran. We'll go over some good drills for introductions. We have a laundry list of those, and then Q&A if time permits. So part one is why the introduction matters. So really, there are three big reasons why we care about the introduction. The first is that it establishes your voice. So that's your rhetorical approach, and what type of language you use, right? And how exactly you approach the question, your sense of pathos. Are you approaching this more from a humorous perspective, or are you someone who's taking a more sobering tone? If you have a question, let's say about some international conflict where people are dying, maybe making light of that's not the best thing to do. And you'll see that, you know, sometimes people, there's a really good speech I remember from nationals a few years ago, and the consensus was among the more content-oriented judges that they got the one. But the problem was that the more delivery-oriented judges and more of the old-school guard of extemp, they were mad because they made a phallic joke. That's what she said joke. And so they ended up getting a bunch of sixes from that, and they ended up placing last in the round. Keep in mind, this was on the national final stage. And so you want to make sure that you're staying appropriate in the introduction. You want to make sure that you're establishing an academic yet still accessible tone, and that's the type of language you want to use moving forward. And then also the intangibles. That's your confidence, your posture, your eye contact, and your volume. It looks like a lot of the tournaments moving forward, at least for the first half of the year, are going to be online. So the more large national circuit tournaments, but at least on the local circuit level, a lot of tournaments are moving back in person in Minnesota, and it might be the same in your states. And so a lot of that stuff is going to be a lot more noticeable. So you're going to need to make sure that you're working on those intangibles, that it factor, if you will. Then the second big thing is it offers important context in your speech. What are interest rates? Your judge might not know that. Who is Jair Bolsonaro? What is he doing to the Amazon? So a good introduction will define technical terms and concepts in a speech. An example of this is, let's say you get a question about modern monetary theory. Don't go into the round assuming your judge is going to know that. Almost assume as if they know nothing, but don't dumb it down too much or don't act patronizing, but go into the round and make sure you're defining a lot of the key operational terms. And so there are two types, right? The first is technical terms, and those are terms that are like specific types of vocabulary, things that are often discussed in political and economic circles. And then the second is this third bullet point that we're talking about, and that stuff related to a speech's burden. So a lot of extemp questions rely on you on framing the speech. So if you get a question like, will the United States be successful in achieving its goals in Afghanistan? Well, your definition of success may be very different from my definition of success. So defining what success is really important. And a lot of extempers fail to do that, which is why, especially in high-level rounds, they don't do as successfully as they could. And that's because they're not defining a lot of terms that are considered subjective. Everyone knows what success means, but we all have different interpretations of it. Interest rates, on the other hand, there's one concrete definition of that, but obviously people might not know what the term is. And so that's why there are, I guess, two different types of variations with that. And then the third big thing is like another example could be who is the best presidential candidate for the GOP. And so in a question like that, what does it mean to be the best candidate? Who are the potential candidates right now? There are potentially an infinite pool of candidates you could choose from, right? For all we know, Mitt Romney could be the next presidential candidate, or Ted Cruz, or Josh Hawley, right? There's so many options. A good introduction does the heavy lifting for you, so it whittles it down the list to 2 to 3 candidates, and you can provide the rest of your speech just focusing on those candidates, and it makes your job as an extemper infinitely easier.
And just to add to what Ananth is saying, especially about the burden of the extemp speech falling to your intro, there's a certain utility in that the introduction comes first. So if you create those precedents early on in the speech about what a certain term means or what direction you're taking in the speech, then it holds from that point onward, which is really important if the judge is looking for consistency, but also if you're getting cross-exed, you can refer to these definitions that you set and make it clear how you're upholding your own argument. And when you create those own conditions early on in the intro, it makes the speech strong from that point forward. So mostly reiteration of what Ananth got through. Number one, make sure that every part of the introduction is fitting the type of question, right? Let's probably not make a joke about famine in Yemen, whereas maybe you can make a joke about the house races. And it's also, even if that's not what you're saying, how you're saying it applies to the same way, where we shouldn't be, happy-go-lucky excited to tell us about how police brutality is on the rise in a few cities across the United States. And same with body language, where, yeah, same idea there. Just make sure that what you're saying and how you're saying it fits with the way that the question is being asked and the content in the question. And then, yeah, once again, we're defining terms and actors. And a good way to think about it is just assume that your judge is like a slightly above average intelligent second grader. Like they might be able to understand an argument, but if they don't know the terms you're working with, then they're not going to get anywhere. So give them everything that they're going to need to understand the whole question and anything you might reference in your argument. And then, of course, on the subjective terms, a lot of questions are going to ask you, like, was it the right choice to do so and so? You have to tell us, well, what does it mean to be the right choice? Does it mean that from this point onward, we're going to have success from that decision? Or does it mean that we're mitigating harm that's been ongoing on that point? And then once you get your judge and yourself on the same page on that exact front, then the rest of your speech is a lot more coherent and it leaves less up for interpretation. Because I think in the ideal extemp speech, right, your judge is understanding every word that you're saying the way that you intend it to be understood. And it's these types of framing in the introduction that allows you to make the speech understandable.
Definitely. And there was one example I was thinking of, this viability example for number 3. So I think this was the question Micah Cash drew. He was the 2014 USX National Champion for NSDA. It was like, is Medicare for all a viable healthcare system? Again, our definitions of viable may be entirely different. Are we talking about politically viable? Does this have a chance of passing through Congress and being signed into law by the president? Are we talking about viable with respect to our healthcare system? If we actually implemented it, just completely ignoring this question of how politically feasible it is, if this just was entered into the real world, would this be a system that is affordable and maintainable, right? So those are 2 very different conceptions of viable. And so it's very important that you define that for the judge. And more often than not, the judge accepts it on face value. If you have trouble justifying why this is the definition you need to focus on, you can usually get out of that by just being like, now most experts define viability as just something like that. Use the nebulous most experts tagging. You can get away with that stuff. And so next we'll talk about the parts of an intro.
Right. So most importantly, understand like intros are not meant to be easy. And I think the introduction is probably the part that I struggled with most when I was learning how to become like a consistently robust extemper. So yeah, we write about that here from an article on the Extemper's Bible, that just the inherent burden of the introduction is pretty great, in that you have to first make your judge interested in the topic. Then you have to give them what they need to understand the speech through the background. Then you have to convince them that it matters. And then you have to relay the question and your answer. And it all has to happen, like it says, just under 1 minute and 45 seconds. And I think the most important thing to consider when you're just thinking about the introduction is that like this is the very first impression that you're showing yourself to the judge. And I mean, these are rounds, 6 speakers, 7-minute speeches. Sometimes the stagger is 12 minutes. So these judges are sitting there for like an hour and a half for these rounds. And imagine you're 6th speaker, this judge is tired and they just want to go home. If you give like even a good but not great intro, then you're setting yourself at a deficit, which is why it's super important to be put together, charming, passionate, and just be super consistent with throughout the whole intro. So even if the judge falls asleep 2 minutes into your speech, at least they remember you had a great start. And really, especially if you're working on, these circuits, local circuits, extemp, a lot of these judges, if you sound confident enough in your analysis, aren't going to question it. But what they can relate to is the type of rhetoric that you provide in your introduction, which means if you just hit the introduction out of the park early on into the speech, it's a very good sign of success throughout the rest of it.
And so, yeah, as Peter was talking about, there are a few different things that an introduction contains. So you have your attention getting device. That's what people talk about when they say AGD. You have the link. Not everyone writes this down on their notepad, but that's basically the thing that gets you between your attention getting device and your background. And you have the context / background itself. You have a statement of significance, that lots of different variations. Some people call it SS, some people call it SIG statement. I just write SOS. It's although that's a confusing acronym for some people because that also means something else. And then the question, and then what's known as your answer, which is just your thesis and points.
Absolutely. So the very first part really of any introduction is the attention getting device, no matter how you actually achieve it. And just like when you write an essay, you don't want to just start getting right into the question at hand. You want to engage the judge. So they would hopefully like want to hear the speech. And so generally we like to say these should be 25 seconds or less. Another benchmark is 2 sentences. It might be long sentences, but yeah, you just got to make the judge interested and willing to hear your topic. So within, conventional extemp, we see that attention getting devices generally fall into 4 categories. So the first one is funny. A humor driven attention getter is pretty simple. You set up a joke, you make the judge laugh, and then your link, of course, contextualizes whatever the joke you made into the topic at hand. And good examples of this is when Jair Bolsonaro like compared the COVID vaccine to turning people into crocodiles. Like you don't even have to go much further than that. It's funny on its own right. And by introducing that as the very starting spot of your speech, the judge is already thinking, okay, this speech is at least going to be entertaining. But like we alluded to early on, this does not fit into every speech you give. The jokes are great sometimes, but a lot of the times they aren't. So don't force a joke into a topic that shouldn't be joked about. But I would say the biggest part about doing an AGD in a humorous style is how you deliver it. Because if you don't look like you're enjoying the own jokes that you're making, then the judge isn't going to enjoy it either. So just keep that in mind, especially once again, very first impression. If you come out with energy in a humorous introduction, then it's going to give you a lot of points early on. Okay, next is the evocative or emotional, and where a joke doesn't work, this one might. So we go back to this famine in Yemen example, and an attention getter that we could talk about here is a personal story of some person in Yemen that is actively going through this crisis. You can relay their story out there. And then now the judge's attention is caught by the speech, not because it's funny or entertaining, but because it's got this heavy tone and that you're invoking their morality. And in terms of delivery here, unlike, super engaged and energetic for the funny, you maybe slow down, you go heavier, you drop your pauses in, because the evocative information that you're giving should be evocatively delivered in the same way. Next, we have context-driven, which you don't see often, but it can be extremely useful. And this is essentially blending your attention getter into the background. You might see questions that maybe you're not comfortable doing an evocative attention getter on a heavy topic, but maybe it's just a super intricate and complex topic that you can't waste 25 seconds on a joke or a story for. So an example of this, like you could be talking about the war in Iraq, which of course is super multifaceted and has all these ideas that lead into it, including American involvement, debothification, and everything, this and that, where giving your judge more context is going to be super helpful. And so obviously you shouldn't, just jump right into regular delivery. You can still make your delivery that of an attention getter, but just content wise, you can just start by giving your judge important information that wouldn't exactly fall into humor or emotion bringing, but is still extremely important to the topic. And so this is really helpful for questions where you have like a lot of actors. So you have a triad or you have a hypothetical, and you need to get a lot established in a very limited time frame. Start by giving them a lot of context and blend it into the more pertinent information within your background. And then by the time you're actually answering the question, the judge feels like they know enough to understand the speech that's coming. And then, of course, the last is the personal anecdote. And the good rule of thumb in extemp is to not use an anecdote, because your relationship with your brother is not like the Americans' relationship with China. And we get this is like easy, but there's no effort involved, and really they don't usually work in just about any scenario. And that's, Ananth, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just don't use anecdotal AGDs.
And a good thing about it is if someone before you uses an anecdote and then you don't, like, they just made you look a lot better. Just think about that within the context of a round.
Exactly. The duality of man. I just one thing I would add is context driven can oftentimes incorporate history. So like, I'm not a dude who's pretty funny when it comes to AGDs. I just think like that type of humor requires like personally, I'm not a big fan of that humor. I think a lot of people aren't, but there's still ways to be interesting. Like you could be that cool, interesting history teacher or professor to your judge. They're like super immersed in that. And example of that was I was giving the speech about populism. I couldn't think of anything funny about populism. I mean, there's definitely things out there, but I couldn't think of anything off the top of my head. So instead, I made this historical parallel between Rome and this movement called the Populares that was started by these people called the Gracchi brothers, and this populist resurgence happening in the United States today. And then you can take that even one step further and have each of the on top. So when you're walking between each point, right, you want something to fill that time. And so that's what an on top is. You can incorporate history even more and extend the analogy. And before you know it, you have this extended analogy that goes from your AGD, carries through each one of your points, is neatly wrapped up in a tidy little bow by the time you're done with your conclusion.
Okay. I just got a DM from Michelle. I will get to this question once we get to the questioning period. But just another example for Ananth. Another example of the context driven. One time I had a speech about the Belt and Road Initiative within Africa. And just like Ananth said, like, okay, you could make a joke about this. It's like, I guess. But I remember what I did is I just talked about the original Silk Road and what it meant for, connecting China with the rest of the world. And it was like simple and it was easy, and it helped the judges understand what was at the time like a budding geopolitical topic. And in that way, yeah, just I 100% agree with Ananth in that giving the history can really help make it easy for the judges.
Yeah. Hi, Caitlin. I don't really know if we can help you much, but yeah, I just wanted to say that like basically the gist of it is that history and that type of stuff helps analogize different situations by grounding it to something more familiar. And so, yeah, that's useful. Also, it's chill if you want to answer Michelle's question now. We're doing pretty good on time.
Sorry. Okay, so Michelle asks how we do like a context-driven attention getter that's short, because she's in an event that only gives 3 minutes for the whole speech, so you can't spend a whole lot of time in the beginning for the AGD. What we do for this? The first thing I would think is that in a 3-minute event, Michelle, is this like extemp where you're super informational and citing things, or is this more like a platform event? Oh, it's Congress. Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So Congress is like, you're obviously not going to have to follow the exact substructure that we lay out for an introduction here, but in the same light, I mean, because some congressional speakers, they do just get out there and be like, I affirm this bill for the following 1, 2, 3. So if you're going to do context driven, then I would say go with it. And then, I mean, it's not like you have to really worry about doing a significant statement or linking it, because I mean, you're all talking about a bill that you already know about. So in terms of just keeping it short, because the whole point of a context driven thing is to give pertinent information, maybe ask yourself, like, what are the 1, 2, or 3 things that you absolutely need to know about this to understand my argument? And then you lay them out early and say, I'm going to get all of this out in 2 sentences or less. And then from that point, you know that you're only summarizing information that's vital to the speech. At the same time, you're giving yourself a constraint. Does that help answer the question, or are you looking for something else? Okay, awesome. Okay, so a link. Like Ananth said, not everyone really thinks this through. I'm one of the extempers that does. Really, in the best attention getters, right? Whatever you're saying to grab your judge's attention is already super connected to the topic at hand. So a link is just like not even a sentence. It can be just a few words that helps bridge the gap between those 2 areas and really transition your speech from, not super informational, not analytical, to the part where like, okay, now you're getting into the stuff that makes the speech what it is. And just remember to yourself, I think one of the biggest utilities of the link, even from not a speech writing standpoint, is that if you're like having a really hard time coming up with a link between your attention getter and your background, then it's probably just not a good attention getter. Because if you can't think of how it's actually connecting to your topic, then it's probably time to rethink it. So when I'm padding, I just like under my AG, I write down an L, and next to it, I write like a word or 2 that helps me explain. This is really only, I think, needed expressly when you're doing like a joke or something. You're saying, like if you're really going out on a limb and being like, in 2020, like we had the Australian wildfires, be like, the year started and the world was literally on fire. It's clear that that trend has now brought itself over to America, but this time it's in the form of the Senate. Like that is awful, and you shouldn't say that, but that's just an example of how you can, connect those 2 ideas with just a sentence or 2 and bring yourself into, okay, well, now I'm talking about the Senate, and it's clear that now the next word out of my mouth is gonna be like, the Economist on March of this year explains. And now you've segued into the meat of the actual background. And then apparently we have an example.
Yeah, just the thing I just wanted to add quickly, and that'll help provide some context for this video. So first off, we switched the video. I should say girl, not guy. But second, you also want to make sure that like the tone fits, right? Like you don't want to be like, yes, here's a really funny joke. Now I'm going to talk about genocide. Like that type of thing. You're just going from like 0 to 100 real quick, and you don't want to do that. Which is what Wendy Williams does in this video.
And he was murdered Monday morning. On a lighter note, Bruce Springsteen's daughter is going to the Olympics.
So maybe not start by talking about murder and then transitioning to some really great event that happened to someone's daughter. But yeah.
And he was murdered.
Okay, so right after you finished up your attention getter and your link, we're heading into the background, also known as the context. And just like Ananth and I have been getting at so far, this is where you're giving the judge exactly what they need to understand the rest of the speech. And so, yeah, first thing you can start with, and the easiest way to figure out how your background should be structured, is what terms does my judge need to understand in order to understand the topic. Like, so one time at Harvard, there was a question I drew: will Hyundai's recent merger with Boston Dynamics threaten Tesla's grip on the emerging autonomous car market? I mean, that is like, so we got Hyundai, we got Boston Dynamics, we get Tesla, and we get the autonomous car market. And so if someone is, like not familiar with automation technology and AI and self-driving and all this, then that question right off the bat is going to scare the judge away. So, you should spend time in your introduction to explain, well, what is Hyundai? What is Boston Dynamics? why did they recently merge? What is the autonomous car market? And what is Tesla's current role? Like, obviously, that's a really extreme example. Most questions are not going to give you that much to explain. But without that information, your judge is going to have a hard time understanding the analysis that you give. Because even if you're doing a great job of explaining, how Hyundai and Boston Dynamics coming together makes them this extreme market force that threatens Tesla, well, if they still don't quite understand what Boston Dynamics is, then you first lost a lot of credibility early on in the speech, but also your judge just isn't going to be with you. Ananth, do you want to talk about the newscaster approach?
Yeah, I just think like if you ever listen to a newscaster, like regardless of like when you're tuning in, especially in like these live events, it's like, oh, I understand the situation. And it's like in a way that's not off-putting to people who've been listening to the news for a while. Like, let's say you're following like a live chase or something. It's not like annoying to those people who've been following it for a while. So like in Peter's instance, right? Like not someone who's like a huge autonomous vehicles geek, right? So it's not like just super patronizing and dumbing it down for those people. But at the same time, it's uplifting to people who are like unfamiliar with the event. And that's why, like, if you listen to, I think maybe the better analogy would have been like late night comedians, especially people like John Oliver, for example, or Trevor Noah. You watch their videos and they take these like really complex issues and they're still able to bring levity out of them and explain them in like a really straightforward and accessible fashion. So like, even if you're like 11 years old, because they're like 11-year-old Trevor Noah fans now, you can still understand that.
Absolutely. Yeah. The next point here about source selection, this is where you can start to draw some credibility. Like say you have a speech about like mining asteroids or something and its economic impact on the United States. Like, should we engage in China with competition here in this regards to asteroid mining? It's like you're going to do a lot better for yourself if you perhaps cite a source from like the American Institution for Aeronautics or the or NASA itself here than if you cite a Huffington Post article. Oh, okay, you shouldn't cite Huffington Post at all. But I suppose what I'm getting at here is if you're citing something super material specific to the content that you're getting into, as opposed to like a more general source like Washington Post, New York Times, Associated Press, then you're going to draw a lot of credibility out early on, where you're saying, not only do I understand this topic, but I can navigate these sources that are specifically about this topic, because I'm more inclined to believe those specific sources if we're getting especially super niche, unique information from there. Like in the Hyundai example, like if you're drawing from Autonomous Vehicles Quarterly, if that's a thing, like then that's what you should be doing it from instead of NPR. And then the last thing here is that background provides a lot of opportunity to start framing your speech, more importantly, framing your answer. And what I mean by framing is to make your judge kind of understand where you're going and almost subconsciously agree with you before you even give the answer. And so where this can work into the background, for example, consider the question, will Republicans see big gains in the 2022 midterm elections? It's like part of your background can be in nearly every midterm election since World War II, the party that is currently holding the president's office has suffered. Well, now your judge is thinking, okay, the Democrats are currently holding the president's office, which means they'll probably suffer in the next midterm. And you haven't given your answer, which if you're going with this approach is probably that Republicans will see big gains. You haven't even given your answer yet, but the fact that you've worked that type of rhetoric into your background specifically means your judge knows where you're going. They're already agreeing with you and everyone's happy.
All right. So I think a lot of us have maybe put back school in like these deep caverns in our brain. We've like mentally compartmentalized off that moment in our lives. But if you do remember something about school, and specifically language arts, you may remember the term exigence, which you can think about as urgency. And that's one of the big rhetorical devices that some of the greatest, rhetoricist is probably not a word, but like, you know what I'm getting at, right? Those types of people was exigence. And that's basically explaining the significance of the topic you're speaking about. And it's basically a one sentence, so what? Because if you're a judge, and going back to what Peter was talking about, you're decaffeinated, you're severely underpaid, you got to make a 1 hour to maybe even like 10 hours, depending on where the tournament is, bus ride over to this crappy high school. And then you got to wake up at 6 a.m. in the morning to wrangle together 30 different high schools and make sure they were all on time. And you're basically very mentally fatigued. And every single time everyone has told you, they've had the audacity to tell you that space lasers or Mars's Perseverance rover is of the utmost significance. It's literally the most important event in the world. Like seriously, like it's more important than poverty or whatever. Like you want to make sure that basically what I'm saying is that the thing you're talking about, the reason why your subject matters, it's proportional to the actual topic. So don't grandstand, but you can take the opportunity during a statement of significance, this one sentence blip, and turn abstract concepts like China's actions in the South China Sea or raising interest rates into something palpable for the judge. What does it mean when the Federal Reserve suggests there's a new interest rate? Well, for commercial banks, that means that loans either become more or less accessible. If you're an average American consumer, that may mean it's easier to pay down a house or it's harder. That may mean it's easier to purchase a car or it's harder to, or your student loans, right? So many different things are controlled directly by the actions of the Federal Reserve, and that's what you're establishing in the statement of significance. What does it actually mean that China is beginning to exert its military influence in the South China Sea? How does that impact the judge? And if it doesn't impact the judge, how does it impact the world in a way that the judge would care about? Oh, China is engaging in a form of modern colonialism by encroaching on other countries' sovereignty or something like that, right? Just explain it in a way that your judge would care about. And that's why I think question selection is also very important in the sense that you're already having to face an extra obstacle if you choose a question that is very niche and specific, especially in a general purpose round where like you may not have judges who are very impressed that you answered a more difficult question, right? For them, it's more off-putting, right? Like the judge is more likely to empathize with the question, let's say about police brutality, than they are going to engage with the question about, I don't even know, it's a very like specific topic. I don't know, like Eskimo wars in Antarctica or something. Or what'd you say, Peter?
Urban heat islands.
Yeah, urban heat islands, right? Like stuff like that. And so that's, yeah. Now, another really big pet peeve I have, and I think a lot of people do this, I've been guilty of this myself, but I think I've started to get out of the habit. It's you list a country's population as a statement of significance. So like considering that the United States has over 300 million people, we must ask today's question. That is always, in my opinion, number one, like misrepresentative of a topic, like unless that thing specifically affects every American citizen. And number two, I think it's uncreative and overused. You'd be surprised, there are probably at least 2 to 3 kids who do that in every single round. And like, let's say like you give a speech about vending machines falling on people. Like if you remember like Guinness Book of World Records and stuff like that, you'll know that's like a very rare occurrence. Like maybe 5 people every single year around the world like die from vending machine falling on them. But like all these books would have you believe it to be a bigger problem, right? But like, let's say I'm like considering that falling vending machines would affect 300 million people in the United States. Like that's not true, right? And so just don't list a country's population. I think it's, to be quite frank, it's a little bit facetious. There are better formats to include. So the first, my favorite, and I think the most powerful, is every X minutes. So like the example here, this one's more of a sobering statistic, but like considering that every 10 minutes, a child under the age of 5 in Yemen dies from preventable causes. And that's a real stat. We must ask today's question. Something like that, you're grounding it to like the most fundamental of things, time itself. And 10 minutes, the judge is like, wow, 10 minutes ago, I was judging some other, or even better, you tie it to the speech itself, considering by the time this speech is done, an additional 100 people will die from the coronavirus. We must ask today's question. That specifically, it's like, wow, the judges, they'll be so impressed when you do that. And I think that format works especially well with COVID-related speeches and things where it's like quite literally a matter of life and death and every single second counts. So that could be gun violence. That could be, a forest fire that is currently active and it's burning like X amount of acres per minute. That could be the coronavirus or other types of pandemics. The second is, this is just an uncreative name. I couldn't really think of anything, but that's like the wowza factor. And so you take something that's maybe a little bit more abstract from the judge and you concretize it by grounding it in something more real for them. So the opioid epidemic, for example, you may have been heard in the news that the United States has faced this crisis where, millions of Americans have now been hooked on opioids and opiates and other types of synthetic drugs. And the result is that, lots of people are hospitalized and die from this crisis. And I can make that very real for the judge by talking about something most Americans know about, the Vietnam War, by saying, considering that more Americans have died from the opioid crisis than have died from the Vietnam War, we must address the second epidemic this nation is facing by asking today's question. And then like the third format is powerful language. Like if all else fails, this is why it's important to build up a vocabulary, read books and stuff like that. You can, like, I can be like, the dog was big. Like I can say that, or I can be like, the creature was a gargantuan beast, but it ended up only being a dog. Like obviously those two are talking about the same thing, but like the second one just has this much more visceral imagery that like the judge just wants to grab onto. And you want to do the same thing. Judge, I'm going to pull you in this direction. I am your captain, you will follow me. And that's what a good extemp speech and the statement of significance does. Peter, do you have anything to add for the statement of significance?
Yeah, I guess the significance of the significance. I think as you get higher and higher into extemp competition, you will see judges that are about to give you your entire ballot on your significance statement. Like, and I think we can attest to this. Like in MBA, there are judges who will tell you, look, that was like an incredible speech. Your analysis was phenomenal, but I still don't believe I should actually care about this topic. And so therefore, if you can create a really strong significance statement, you'll get the berths of like a lot of judges super early on. But just by connecting the judge directly to the topic, they're obviously going to be not only a lot more willing to listen, but they'll be more open to your arguments, and that, okay, maybe I don't really believe that this like specific healthcare solution is the answer to all our problems. But now that I know like how it's affecting Americans, like my neighbor every day, then I'm more willing to listen to this kid who's come up here to tell me about it.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the final part's the most intuitive part. You're reciting your question, giving your answer, which is the thesis and the text. But a few things you still have to remember about that. First, you want to recite your question word for word. Like if you're totally messing up the question, you could be answering a completely different question, and judges look down upon that. Some judges might think that you're doing that on purpose. So like, let's say the question is, should the United States pass Medicare for all versus will the United States pass Medicare for all? I just switched out one word, and yet that creates an entirely different question. That might confuse judges, anger others. More broadly, I think it's more innocent mistakes, but still, like you want to maintain this appearance of professionalism, and part of that is making sure you get the question word for word. Like it is fine if, maybe you use the plural instead of the singular or something like that, or you switch an article, you say N instead of the or something like that. But for the most part, you want to make sure you're reciting your question exactly as it is. Then you want to have a thesis. So many extempers just say yes for 3 key reasons. And you want to make sure you're getting out of that habit. If I just asked you a question and like, let's say I took out all of your points. Like I just asked you, should we have Medicare for all? Yes, for 3 key reasons. That's not actually an answer, but maybe one like, yes, it democratizes access to healthcare. And that is something I can actually understand, right? Or grab onto, or no, it seeds the United States' innovative spirit or something like that, right? So you want to make sure, and that's supposed to say 5 to 7 word argumentative thesis, but you want to make sure that you're not just saying yes for 3 key reasons. Then as you recite your points, you want to make sure that you're not saying like finally, but perhaps most importantly on your third point. I think that's another thing a lot of extempers do. I'll be real, I sometimes still do this too, but more often than not, it's just a crutch phrase, because either one, you're trying to remember your tag, you're trying to recollect your thoughts. But is your third point really the most important? Is it actually? More often than not, it's probably not. Or because usually some other point's more important, or they're equally important. One other thing I forgot to add is there's this concept in extemp called the crap sandwich. So you want to put your best points as your first and third point and your worst point in the middle. So when you're reiterating your tags, you want to make sure that your tag in the middle is like your worst point. And then finally, you want to make sure your tags are actual arguments. Like let's go to an example. Should the United States, or how can the United States help China? And then you're like, the answer is 3 key steps. First, militarily, second, economically, and third, politically. First, just not an actual thesis, but then second, that's not an actual argument. Like if I just asked you in a bubble, I took out the thesis and everything else, and I just asked you, like, for example, hey, Peter, what's a step the United States can take to help South Korea? And you're like, economically. I just be like, what is this dude saying? And so you want to make sure you have like an actual tag, like They can leverage, I don't know, phone ops operations, or they can place joint economic sanctions onto North Korea. Those are specific, concrete, and actionable steps, not militarily, economically, politically, right? And so I just really want to emphasize that tags are super duper important. What you'll notice is that a lot of judges, even at tournaments like NSDA Nationals, they're not your extemp specialists. More often than not, they're your everyday speech coach or even a debate coach or a parent judge, right? And the way that they gauge your content isn't by actually focusing on your substructure and all the neat little arguments that you have under each point. A lot of judges literally evaluate content based on the clarity of your tags. That's the only thing they talk about when they're discussing your content and how good of a speech you have. And so you want to make sure that your tags are really clear and crystal. And more than that, you're repeating each tag at least 3 times throughout the speech. Once during your preview, during the introduction, once as you repeat each point itself, like as you go along the speech, and then once as you conclude your speech and you recap your points in your thesis. And so that has the ability to stick to the judge's mind. And so you really want to take full advantage of that. And so that's why I think another good thing you should try to do is like have very powerful verbs. Literally like look up at the source if you need to and replace some of those more basic and vanilla like language, right? Like maybe, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but just take things that sound like a third grader would say them and, make it a little bit more powerful and visceral. Obviously in a way the judge still understands, but you get my gist.
Yeah, I think like an example there, like maybe instead of saying we're angering China, it's like emboldening China to take action, even if it's like that simple. And then the only thing I would add, just on the idea of the thesis, like Ananth said, it absolutely strengthens your argument as a whole. But another key part of it is that it really consolidates the points that you make. So if we go back to Ananth's example of democratizing healthcare within the context of Medicare for all, like even if you're talking about how Medicare for all is, improving overall access, it's expanding what Medicare can cover, and it's decreasing, leverage that big pharmacy companies have. Like without the thesis statement of democratizing healthcare, as they stand, those 3 points are all very valid and relevant, but they aren't exactly working together in the speech. But the thesis statement is what brings them together and shows that you're not just telling us about Medicare for all, but you're using these 3 reasons to actually answer the question.
So we got a question from Michelle. She asks, sometimes I get on my ballot that my AGD can be too visceral. What can I do to resolve this? So that might be a question with verbiage, how long your AGD is. So there definitely is this balancing act between having this very illustrative language that the judge can latch onto, but also at the same time not being too verbose in your speech. And so you want to make sure that that might be a timing problem, would be my only guess. Otherwise I would have to see it, because I'm not sure otherwise what it might be. But yeah, like I think that's a problem with like a lot of writers too, going into that realm. So like a lot of people, they write pretty just for the sake of writing pretty without having it necessarily advance some goals. And so you want to make sure that you're not giving like the Shakespearean soliloquies during your extemp speech. You want to make sure that the language you use and the imagery you use is serving a purpose. So it's accessible. But if you are doing that, I have no idea. Maybe like after this is over, you can share an AGD and you can see. But yeah.
Right. So just onto general timing of the introduction, like this says 1:15 to 1:30, and the longest should be about 1:45. And keep in mind, this includes when you say your answer and repeat the question. And this really just comes down to A, how much time are you saving for the rest of your speech, including your points? B, does your judge feel like this is dragging on? And then C, how concise you are. Do you have a solid word economy, or are you saying things in double the words that they actually take?
If you see the 5 down in hand signals as 5, and you're still on your introduction, you should be getting out of there as quickly as possible. Yeah. You may have to cut some of your on tops to stay on time. So just tying it all together for you.
Right. Yeah. So of course, the attention getting device, bring your judge into it, make them want to listen, link, connect whatever you just said to the topic at hand. the background, probably the most important part, is what is currently going on. Identify your terms and why this matters within the context of the question. Statement of significance, make your judge feel like this matters. And then finally recite the question, bringing us to today's question, make it clear that you're actually, doing what extemp asks you to do.
Just a heads up, there is a chance that we run over 7, in which case, if you have to leave after that, that's fine. Otherwise, we can go into that. I do have a question, and I struggle with getting an introduction done within 2 minutes, and I believe it's due to the context portion. So you have any tips to make all of that info more concise? I know that's vague, but just generally. I can speak to this really quickly, and then Peter, if you have anything to add.
Sure.
I used to struggle with this too. I think for one thing, if your intros are super long, try to cut down on your AGD a little bit, and then context, because those are the 2 areas usually that take up the bulk of time. And within the context, the first thing is you want to make sure that you have a very strong word economy. And we'll get to some of the drills to improve that. So some specific tools you can make sure to effectively convey the same idea in fewer words. That's what word economy is all about, and drills relating to that. And I think the other thing too is you want to make sure you don't have to define like all the terms. Like you don't have to define what means or what the article the means, right? And so there may be a point of over defining. And so we'll watch this video by Miles Safran after Peter adds anything, if he has any comments. And I think that helps maybe concretize what a good introduction looks like and all the different components it has. This does run I think, actually, no, this is a good time to run. It's maybe like 140 or so. But I think if you like take out all of the audience noise and stuff like that, this would be a well-timed introduction. But Peter, you have anything to add before then?
The only thing is I just like conventional backgrounds in extemp, you don't need more than 1 source. And if you're doing 2 sources, great. Just make sure that all the information is relevant. So like, I guess truly ask yourself what the purpose of each, bit of information that you're giving them, what is its purpose to the rest of the speech? And if that purpose is vague or you can't identify it, then just don't worry about saying it.
Yeah. Right. So as we talked about, this is the guy who won the IX final at NSDA in 2014. And I think he does a good job with the intro.
Our second speaker is number 144, addressing the question, will Boko Haram cause the fall of the Nigerian government? Number 144, addressing the question, will Boko Haram cause the fall of the Nigerian government?
In his landmark work, The Prince, Italian philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli asks whether a leader should be loved or should be feared. Eventually, he concludes that a ruler should be feared in order to best consolidate political power. Yet, at some point along his illustrious political career, Nigeria's President Goodluck Jonathan must have decided that the prince wasn't worth his time, since rather than being a loved or feared ruler, he's decided to go for the third option, being widely laughed at. In fact, as the Center for a New American Security explains in May of 2014, most Nigerians regard their government with a degree of skepticism. After all, Goodluck Jonathan hasn't generated the economic and political potential that many see Nigeria as the key to unlocking. Yet the article notes that there's an even bigger threat to Goodluck Jonathan's power in the case of Boko Haram, a group whose moniker cheerfully translates to Western education is sin and has been perpetrating terrorist attacks across the country. With the kidnapping of 260 schoolgirls from the state of Chibok, international attention has refocused on Boko Haram's activities. Yet the question of whether the Nigerian government can do anything about it leads to questions about its overall sovereignty. And considering that Nigeria, as one of the largest African states in terms of economic and political might, could cause a huge amount of instability across the region if it collapsed, forces us to ask today's question: will Boko Haram cause the fall of the Nigerian government? And the answer, sadly, is absolutely, specifically for 3 key reasons. First, by declaring sovereignty over northern areas. Second, by bringing in huge influx of terrorist networks. And finally, by mobilizing sentiments against Goodluck Jonathan and his government.
So obviously that wasn't a perfect introduction, right? Like he did that for 3 key reasons and stuff like that. And maybe statement of significance could have been stronger, but overall, I think that was a very good introduction. The AGD was under 25 seconds and managed to balance humor with topicality. He had contextualization that not only established Good Luck Jonathan's ruling as a whole in Nigeria, but also Boko Haram's tie into that. He added some exigence when he talked about the kidnapping of hundreds of schoolgirls in Chibok. And I think especially the context portion was really good. So yeah. And then finally, before we get to the Q&A section, just some useful drills and resources to help become a better speaker, especially at the AG or with your intros. So the first thing is called the AGD transition game. This is where you rattle off unrelated extemp topics. So maybe the Iran nuclear deal, the 2022 midterms, and Uzbekistan's economy. And the speaker, that could be you, has to effectively link together these topics until they either stumble, so maybe they have a vocal error or something like that, or they pause for too long because they have to think too much. And if they make it to 3 minutes without doing either of those things, they win. What this teaches you to do is speak on the spot very well, talk about topics you might otherwise be unfamiliar with, and it forces you to effectively link together topics in a seamless way. And this was a drill proposed originally by Meredith Deedon, and she ended up coaching 2 national champions, 3 national titles between the 2 of them. And I think it's a really good drill, and especially if you're struggling with AGDs, if you're struggling with fluency breaks, this could be something nice. The second thing is called the concision drill, and it's basically a context to see who has the best and shortest explanation of a complex current event. You know, like you can do this with your team and have people vote on it. So like maybe you're like, okay, both of you take 2 minutes to think of the best definition possible to define interest rates or something like that, or think 2 minutes to define what UBI is. Take that time, and then by the end of it, we'll have one person go, then the next person go. And that, you know, going back to the introductions maybe being too long, this can be something to help condense down on that, because you're effectively taking topics that are otherwise super complex and making them much more simple. And the next drill is called seamless transition. So you give a political topic, let's say like the Kentucky Senate race. And then you just like take 3 random words. It can be really random, like pickles, Wall Street, and algebra 2, right? They have nothing to do with each other. But then you have 1 minute to seamlessly tie the 3 words together throughout that 1 minute. And that forces really smooth delivery. Obviously, you don't want to have an AGD in the future where you're linking pickles to Kentucky's Senate race. What this drill teaches you to do is, again, it's a useful drill for fluency. And if you're able to tie those 2 really unrelated topics together, hopefully your links also improve. Then we're getting some alliteration in the drill, wearisome wizardry. And you're basically taking topics that seem very bland, quantitative easing, political developments with like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and more. And you're figuring how to make them seem very important in 1 sentence. This is very useful for statements of significance because you're basically taking topics that the judge might otherwise not care about, and you're forcing yourself to explain why they matter. And that's just another useful drill, I think.
Right. And then lastly, this works for, I think, any part of extemp that you're trying to work on, but just recording yourself. But then the twist that we have here is you can give a typical introduction and watch yourself 3 times over, once with the sound off, once with the video off, and then once normally. And then that'll allow you to pinpoint some of the parts of the introduction, whether that be the actual words you're saying, your body language, your delivery, and then it really, allow you to focus on every single part of the introduction that you're giving, not just what you're saying. And then second, we have recording yourself just for the content. So of course, give the typical introduction and record yourself. And then, you know, rewatch your videos and then try and switch your perspectives to see what this would mean to someone who maybe doesn't quite understand the topic, like someone who's maybe been researching it for a while or just got all their information from a 30-minute prep time. But really, it's about putting yourself in your audience's shoes to make sure that you're giving relevant information and it's understandable.
Okay, and then just the last one. There are 2 more drills. So this is another really good one to help if your intros are going over. So give an introduction in 90 seconds, and give one in 80 seconds and 70 seconds. Keep going by 10-second increments. You can be 5, whatever you want, until it becomes too difficult. And by the end, hopefully you should be able to give an entire introduction in 30 to 40 seconds. That really forces you to improve your word economy. Like, think about someone like Trump. Like, Trump rambles on and on and on, love him or hate him, right? But you have to admit that he's not necessarily the most eloquent or necessarily concise of speakers. You want to avoid that type of speaking, and maybe you want to speak not necessarily bluntly, but you want to make sure that you're able to explain things in a more concise manner. And then the final one is called content analyzer. It's basically like you give a speech and analyze your content based on the tags alone. And this should teach you to create strong tags. So going back to the example, right? Let's say I took out all the parts of my speech except for my question, my answer, or my thesis, and my 3 points. If I just looked at my thesis and my 3 points, would I be convinced that this is the best answer possible? That's how strong you want your tags and thesis to be. So I know we're at 6:58, and so I'm sorry if any of you have to leave. I will send out the presentation link, but if you want to stay, we can now do a Q&A, go back to any parts, answer any questions and stuff like that. Okay, anyone have any questions, or are we all good? Okay then. Well, if you do have any questions, feel free to stick around afterward. Oh, there we go. What are some good ways to make more serious AGDs? Peter, you want to take this one first?
Yeah. So just like we talked about earlier, first, understand the question. And so I'm assuming that by the time we're here, we're thinking, okay, we need a serious AGD. So then I suppose we can start with what not to do, right? Like, don't make the jokes, and going back to the drill we just discussed, where if you're recording yourself, even if you're not saying the words, just think about how your body is looking. If you're watching that tape over without any sound, does it look like you're giving a serious, heavy topic? Does it look like you're delivering a joke, or can you not tell? So I would say when you're delivering the more serious AGDs, just try and focus on, I know it's hard, right? But try and focus on every single part of your delivery to make sure that it's all working together to give that message. But in terms of actually making the serious AGDs, I'm guessing you're asking about like what content to actually include. Just think about, in the same nature of your background, like what is really relevant to the topic, not just the topic as a whole, but what's relevant to make the judge understand the heaviness of the topic. And when you do this, just like I think we discussed in one of the articles on Extempor's Bible, like giving those personal anecdotes of someone within the region who's been through that. You think about how that content, you could be just telling us, right, that there's a war happening and that people are dying. But then you give us the name of some person who's actively going through this crisis, then you're giving them the same content, right? But you're making it more serious in the way that it's relevant to the individual person. Ananth, do you want to maybe clean up that answer? I don't know if
the only thing else I would add is, with more serious AGDs, I think the most important thing to do is look for stuff you can find online that maybe isn't based in comedy. So like, let's say you get a question about the crisis in Yemen. There's chances are it's a question being asked in an extemp tournament. The Economist has an article on it. And you'll see that more often than not, Economist articles are more interesting or serious than they are funny. And so each article is like an extemp speech in itself, because that introduction is almost like an AGD. So my suggestion would be to look at sites like The Economist or the Human Rights Watch and see what type of information you could find on a site like that. And obviously the other component of it is to have a more serious tone. Because like, even if like what you're saying isn't necessarily super serious, if you deliver it in a serious way, you can like make the judge feel emotionally invested. One other thing I'll quickly add is you don't want to make it like too sobering or sad that like the judge is super downtrodden for the rest of the speech and it's like only half paying attention and just half thinking about like the really atrocious thing you were just talking about. And so you don't want to make it like too sad, like you're not trying to do like a try not to cry challenge, So make sure it's like an appropriate blend of I guess, seriousness, but also at the same time, unseriousness. I don't know, just like not super serious, you know? Okay, so we got two questions. So I'll start with the first one I got, which is, for example, if you were coming up with a speech on why we shouldn't implement carbon tax because it hurts low-income Americans and contributes to offshoring. So an example about carbon tax, where you're like talking about how it hurts low-income Americans and contributes to offshoring. There are different ways you could do an AGD. So maybe like you have an anecdotal like piece of evidence, like you talk about one dude who's like been really affected by, you know, an oil tax or something like that, right? And then throughout speech, maybe each one of your on tops in your conclusion also talks about the person. That's one way you could do it. Another way you could be like, you have this piece of rhetoric enshrined in the American Constitution as a promise of life, liberty, and happiness for every single American. But the unfortunate reality is that the economic obstacles that have been set up in the past have disproportionately disadvantaged certain groups. And today, once again, another foolish economic proposal, maybe don't use foolish because that's alienating, threatens to economically disaffect Americans or something like that. Peter, want to talk a little bit more about that? Here, let me paste it in. So I think it was a direct message to me. But here's like the example.
Oh, okay. So is this question just like asking on what our approach would be, or is there like a specific part of the introduction you want?
AGD.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is this still asking about like the seriousness of the AGD?
Yeah. I think.
Okay. Sweet. Gotcha. Then yeah. So this is where, okay. So you're saying that in your answer, you're talking about it hurts low-income Americans and contributes to offshoring. Okay, I think the first thing I need to say is this doesn't necessarily need to be a super serious introduction, right, Ananth? I mean, because like it's not calling on you to consider some super heavy topic that, you know, is hard to discuss, right? It's a carbon tax. But if you are trying to be serious, then I guess think about seriousness on the air of credibility, like really bring out your logos. And instead of making a joke about it, give us some scientific source about like the development of what the carbon tax is and like its history within the United States, because then you're still serious, but instead of, you know, trying to invoke some sort of emotion from the judge, it's just showing them that this speech is going to be knowledgeable and analytical, and that we're already starting that way with the information we're giving you early on.
To be honest, I think the general rule of thumb is you can keep it light, and it doesn't have to be serious unless it's like a topic like police brutality or an ongoing conflict where like millions are dying. With like a carbon tax, people aren't dying, right? And so like, yes, like you could be like, so I would basically say save the emotional impact for each one of the points within your speech, but you can have a more lighthearted AGD in the introduction itself, and then take some of that pathos and instill it within the impact. So got another question, which is like, you have a lot of AGDs borrowed from late night shows and satirical sites like The Onion and The Horowitz Report, given the other places that you get ideas from AGDs. I'm guessing this is specifically humorous. So one site I always use is called UpJoke, and I'll just search UpJoke plus the topic. It's spelled up and then joke. And they always have like, basically it's like an aggregator of a bunch of comedians, like jokes about an issue or a country or something like that. I think that always works well if you're like looking for some type of comedy. So maybe you're like UpJoke the economy. You'll get a bunch of funny economic jokes and you can take some of them. Second would be, I think, a general format for any international topic. And this is one I if you really can't find anything, is you name a country, then you say famous for X, Y, and Z, has recently found itself in the news for another thing. So like an example could be Brazil, famous for its white sand beaches, carnival festivals, and then the third one always has to be something funny. You have to play it up. And lest we forget, Shakira, just something like that, right, has also found itself in the news for something less pleasant recently, because, or something like that. And I think that type of AGD works well as a canned AGD, although I recommend straying away from that. I would also say that, generally speaking, like if it is really hard for you to find a joke, and like it really is taking that long to come up with one originally, don't worry about that. Like, I don't think I've ever come up with like an original joke in an extemp speech. More often than not, I'm stealing it off of tweets I've seen in the past or late night comedians jokes and stuff like that. And in the case where I have to come up with one by myself and it's like hard for me to think of, then I'll just do like an interesting history bit or something like that. Like the Populares thing. That wasn't funny, but it was still interesting and it still got judges engaged. Peter, you have anything to add to that?
Just along the same line as Ananth, with the up joke, like if you use Reddit, there's a subreddit called Not the Onion, which gives you like news reports of things that you would imagine would be on the Onion, but actually happened. And you can play those off as funny. And just like Ananth was saying earlier, though, like The Economist, for example, always starts their articles off with something, and a lot of times it is funny. Like they do a lot of jokes. So don't be afraid to like take them from the actual articles you're giving. But I think Ananth hit most of it in terms of like getting ideas for the AGD. Like this is not like the AGD, especially a humorous one, like very important part of your speech, right? But not worth wasting 5 minutes of your prep time to think through. So if it comes to you, it comes to you, but more often than not, it's like, this is something you already know about the topic and let's bring it out here. Don't be afraid to, I guess if you don't have a joke, don't try and force a joke. There's absolutely nothing wrong with like just the tiniest bit of context and dropping in if you have no other option.
Mm-hmm. I think another thing, just one thing that when you were talking, you reminded me of was if the topic itself isn't funny, like related to a topic, tangentially related to it, that is funny. So for example, let's say we're talking about a specific congressional bill. It's super boring, right? It's just a bunch of legalese and other type of jargon. But like maybe I just make this joke like, it's often said that if con is the opposite of pro, then Congress is the opposite of progress or something like that, right? And indeed, we're seeing that in the most recent version of America's Bill or something like that. In a case like that, I'm not actually joking about the specific bill, but something related to it. If you want, you can look for inspiration in this extemper named Olivia Shoemaker. She was known for doing that a lot. And what she would do is she'd almost make like these extended analogies that are still relevant, right? Like we're not comparing your brother to the US-China conflict. But like maybe, for example, you're comparing like one ridiculous political situation in North Korea with a more recent one that's harder to joke about or something like that. And if you really need inspiration, just watch how, honestly, to me, it's less about the joke you deliver and more about how you structure that joke. Yeah, she gave a speech about Venezuela. I got second, I think, at NATS that year. But just keep watching all of these different extemp speeches and you'll see like how people structure the jokes, what get the most laughs. And we also have an article about it on extempers.org. If you just search up like the art of the AGDs, you can see more information about that. Any other questions?
What exactly are you asking with abolishing ICE? Like just what type of intro or?
I'm guessing AGD again. Like if you had an AGD like that.
Sorry, yeah. So you're asking like what type of AGD we would go with? I mean,
with that, I think you're not talking about like the humanitarian subject itself. Like you're not directly talking about like ICE, for example, being accused of putting people in cages. You're talking about abolishing the agency. And so in a case like that, I think you could go either way. You could like start off with the more sobering one, but you could also pull off some comedy and judges wouldn't get mad. And you can leave the more emotional stuff in the impacting. Like I do agree that you need to pay lip service to the fact that there is controversy over, in this case, like the humanitarian crisis and controversies that ICE has been embroiled in. But I think you don't have to do that in the introduction necessarily. You can do that throughout each one of the points and still pay acknowledgement to some of the reasons why it's under hot water. Or you could do that even in the context, right? Like we talk about relevancy and exigence. Like why is this question being asked now? Well, it's because ICE has come under a wave of human rights violations. And the other thing too is like if the subject itself is controversial, ICE, maybe you link it to something funny. Like maybe you poke fun at the director of ICE, right? You make fun of how stupid they're being or something like that, or a crazy decision they've made, or like a weird hobby they have. In a case like that, see, I'm not making fun of the humanitarian situation that ICE has been placed in, but instead I'm talking about something, again, slightly related to it that still provides for a seamless link and doesn't alienate judges.
Yeah. I think, I would actually say like ICE is something you would like be careful with, right? A lot of people hold that, close to home, whether it be family members or what they've seen in the media. So like maybe joking about it sets you off on the wrong foot from the start. So, I mean, for this introduction, right? I honestly think Ananth did everything, I guess. Just, yeah, all I was going to say is be really careful if you're doing the humor. Like what Ananth said, don't make a joke about the people in their situations, but if you can get to some topic that's still related, but not going to make someone feel like you're trivializing the issue, then definitely go for that.
Exactly.
Is that everything?
Do you have any tips for getting away with humor in your AGD with very controversial topics, more political topics, for example, Trump, while making sure you don't offend anyone because you live in Arkansas? Yeah, that just don't be like, start off the bat like, Trump is stupid, I hate him, he's a fat, dumb orange monkey or something like that. Like that obviously is gonna put you in hot water, but like you can make fun of, I think the best way of putting it is don't attack personality, but you can attack some of the actions. Be like, when Trump treated Kofe or something and he doubled down it, like just, that's ridiculous, right? And then he pretends like it's a real word or like it's like this secret little hunt or something like that. People are supposed to find the clues and figure out the word. Like that's something you can make fun of. I think also there are some things that are, if you can poke fun of both sides, like that's a good way too. So I remember this panel and it was like evenly split between, I had some conservative judges, I had some, I think I had a literal communist judge, I think too. And then I had like a more moderate judge. And in a case like that, what I ended up doing is poking fun at both Democrats and the Republicans, right? And in the process, like I remember all the judges like writing, I appreciate the fact that you were able to approach a situation in a way where you like adeptly handled all of these different political perspectives. And if you want inspiration for that, watch late night comedians and watch how they're able to, like I think Conan O'Brien does a really good job of this, where he's able to take issues from both sides and like make fun of it in a way I think that's palatable for liberals and conservatives. One quick thing too I'll say is, like if this does become a recurring issue, like where regardless of how you phrase it, people are getting really mad, maybe try exploring IX a little bit more, because I think that if I'm being completely honest, because I think that international topics are far less polarizing. And then maybe if you do venture outside of local circuit tournaments in Arkansas and you start going to national circuit tournaments, we're drawing from a wider base of judges. In cases like that, then you can maybe foray back into the DX world. And that gives you exposure to both categories, which I think is honestly the most optimal way to do extemp.
I didn't really have any issues with like anyone getting offended at nationals this year. It was just our districts tournament where I'm pretty sure I did a joke about Trump and vaccines, I guess, because yeah, I'm pretty sure my topic was COVID related, and one of the judges pointed out that that she was offended, and I guess that wasn't really my intention. It was just supposed to be a funny AGD, but
yeah, I think if you have an anti-vaxxer judge, I'll be real, I think there may be out of the realm of reality intelligence. But I think also maybe there is like a point about not just like being like, even though it's like fun to poke fun of like anti-vaxxer and stuff like that, not being like they're a bunch of uneducated, stupid hicks who marry their cousins, right? But I guess I'd be something you have to watch the AGD for itself. Like there are some clearly offensive AGDs. So if there's this one video from nationals, this person got sixth and for good reason. This is really why AGDs matter. And she's like, there are two types of Indians. There's the feather kind and there's the do your SAT kind. I was like, that offended like a bunch of people and for good reason. And that's like the type of AGD you want to avoid. I think another good extemper is like Jackie Way. You watch her videos, like she directly speaks on these political subjects, like relating to Trump and Biden, or not Biden, but like the Dems, right? And she's still able to do it in a way that is like accessible from both sides. But in that case, like the case you mentioned, I think that might have been a specific judge issue. Obviously, there are some judges who may be just beyond like loss and they're beyond the realm of reason. And in a case like that, it may just be about hemorrhaging the damage and preventing those people from just totally screwing up your ranks by giving you a 6, maybe get like a 3 from them and the 1 the other judges. You qualified to nationals, so obviously you're doing something right.
Yeah. The only thing I would add is like, yeah, first of all, like it sounds like you know your audience. Like if you're deep in Trump County, then maybe it's time to just stop going with Trump jokes altogether. But I think the only thing that I really learned on like polarizing AGDs is like, okay, if you're in your prelims and you got one judge, like then you're like 50-50. Like, are they Democrat? Are they Republican? Am I going to offend them by suggesting that like this Republican senator like messed up? But when you're deeper into elimination rounds, like maybe you have a 5-panel judge, like at that point, you're not supposed to try and win over the whole panel. You're supposed to win over 3 of the judges and make the other 2 respect your argument enough to not give you a 6, even if they're not like politically affiliated with it. So I would say like take a little more liberty if you have more judges, but err on the side of caution when you're just tangoing with one.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the other thing is question selection is actually really important with this type of stuff. Always make sure your questions aren't guided by morality, but they're guided by some type of like legislation or something by that. And what I mean is, let's say you get a question like, should we defund the police? Honestly, defund the police is just such a big term that it's not really a legislative question as much as it is a question of morality and your conception of the police in its current state. Another good example of this could be, should we ban abortion? Technically, yes, that's related to legislation, right? But I think abortion is more of a moral debate than it is a legislative one, versus a question that's more guided by policy. So a question like that could be, how can the United States reduce institutional racism? Right? That is a specific one where you are introducing policy proposals. And the question, implicit in the question, is that institutional racism is a problem. So you don't have to, like, let's say you have a judge who, for some reason, doesn't think racism is a problem. You don't have to be the one to justify that it is. You're like, the question is already asking that. And my point is like, at the point where we take that racism as a problem at face value, how can we solve it, right? And so take advantage of some of the assumptions that questions make. That's one thing I would say. And then the other thing too is, honestly, this may be a strat, like watch Democrats or Republicans in counties where they're solidly blue or solidly red. So like a Democrat running in very conservative Arkansas or a Republican running in very liberal California, and watch how they're able to give speeches there, because the tone and rhetoric they use is very different than the average Democrat or Republican. And viewing that may honestly be helpful in your case.
So Michelle asked about tips for creating AGDs on the economy. Okay. One, I would say, Ananth, are you familiar with that? I think it was Errol Rende. I think he was a national champion in like 2013 or 2011 in USX.
Champion twice, 2013, 2014, coached by Meredith Eden, the coach we were talking about before. And he gave an economic speech both times. Yeah. Really good speeches.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, I think so. He gives an economic speech both times, and you would like the topic sounds so boring, but somehow he managed to make them interesting. So first of all, I'd say Errol Rende, watch that stuff. But then I think I mean honestly, like it's I understand this might start to be repetitive, but like back to the stuff that Ananth was saying, like you don't have to make a joke about, quantitative easing. Like you can make a joke about literally any aspect of spending money, right? And then if you have a strong enough link, or really any link at all, you can be like, well, this isn't so far different from this debate on quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is this, this, and this. Yeah. And then, so I guess that's the humor thing. And then if you're doing your seriousness, of course, I think that only, when you're talking economy, that really should only come in the significance when you're telling your judge, like these economic conditions put, this many people at risk of famine over the next, X years, then that's where you can, drop the heaviness on them. Anything else?
The one thing I guess I would say is, you covered it very well. And I think part of it too is, like, again, make fun of the people surrounding the issue, or make fun of like things surrounding the issue than it itself. So maybe you don't talk about quantitative easing, make a joke about the Federal Reserve, or make a joke about like it's often said that former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, lost his hair because he tore it all out during the Great Recession. Indeed, it was arguably the most stressful time of his life, as he had to manage a multi-trillion-dollar economic crisis. One of the solutions Bernanke had was quantitative easing, which once again is being adopted in markets today. Indeed, as an article by the Financial Times explains, right, I made zero jokes about quantitative easing. My joke was entirely about how a recession is stressful, which is like, no crap, right? And stuff like that. And so that's the type of analysis that you can have. Also with economics one specifically, like if it is a really boring subject, sometimes you can play that up. And you can be like, in fact, when the Federal Reserve decided that it was going to raise interest rates by 0.25%, millions of Americans held their hands together and sang Kumbaya as they marched on Washington for the second coming of the economic civil rights or something like that. Just play up the fact that it's really boring, right? Like obviously no one's going to be super pissed that the Fed raised interest rates unless you're like maybe a financial analyst. And so play that up, and sometimes these issues can be boring. They can be mundane. But yeah.
I guess the only other thing I would say for an economic speech, like I know a lot of extempers who consider like economic speeches to be the most difficult thing you can encounter in a DX round, because unlike a lot of topics, you kind of do have to know what you're talking about for it to make sense, especially to like an adult judge, and especially to an adult judge who's educated on the topic. So I think a good rule of thumb is like really working your credibility into the background by like even if you're like inflation, for example, like you can assume that, you know, most people understand what inflation is, but you can build just a ton of credibility and be like, and that's why, you know, like some investors are worried that inflation is going to start happening again, which is the general trend where the value of the dollar decreases over time. Therefore, you can't buy as much with the money you already have. Like you're giving a super simple explanation of inflation, and maybe the judge doesn't need it, but what it does do is it shows them that you understand the topic. And that's a great way to start like any economic speech, in my opinion.
Definitely. And we actually, on our YouTube channel, The Extempers Bible, we just uploaded a lecture about economics. If you want to watch that, we'll probably upload this video either tomorrow or Wednesday, but yeah, it's useful too. Hopefully provides that knowledge. Any other questions? Yeah, for sure. You can send over your AGD, Michelle.
Awesome. Should we wrap it up?
Yeah, doesn't look like we have any other questions. If you do, you can just email theextempersbible@gmail.com. You can also just write outreach@extempers.org. Either of those should work. And I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Well, you can also add comments to the YouTube video once we upload it. But yeah, thanks for asking questions. You two are the only ones brave enough to do that. Appreciate it.